Hello, everyone. Welcome to week three's weekly announcement. This is Kyle, your instructor for the course, Anthropology 2202. So this week, our title of the module is Opening to New Questions, where we're going to be getting a new perspective on some of the things that we take for granted as familiar or perhaps normal. I want to start off by saying that it looks like all of the assignments for last week were able to be completed by most of you. And so for the most part, I don't really have any points to make about those assignments in terms of trying to complete them more adequately. This week, we will do it all again. We have quiz number 2, challenge number 2, and reflective note number 3. As always, please feel free to comment on the announcement post here with any questions you have about the week or the course. You can always email me, visit me in my office hours over Zoom, or go to the Ask the Professor discussion board on Carmen, on our Carmen page in the modules. Firstly, I will say well done with last week, though. You completed the first ethnographic challenge of the course, and most of you did this with a lot of enthusiasm, which I always welcome. I loved hearing about how this experience was for all of you. I thought it was especially interesting how many of you had similar experiences with feelings of anxiety prior to talking to people who ended up being your informants. And by the time that the interview was complete, you noticed that your reservations to talking to a stranger had dissipated. Making connections with human beings has a real impact on your internal reality, and I'm glad to see that so many of you shared that same sort of eye-opening experience. I also noticed that many of you didn't get discouraged when you were turned down by possible interviewees. You kept going until you found someone that was willing to speak with you. And that is exactly the sort of fortitude and perseverance that an anthropologist has to harness when talking with people that they don't really know, or they don't know who they are, or when they are an outsider to a group of people whose perspectives they are interested in. And lastly, I found it reaffirming of the anthropological process in its ability to understand the relatedness of human differences by the ways that many of you had talked to people who had different backgrounds and cultural affinities than yourself, yet you were still able to hear out your informants and listen to where they were coming from. For many of you, this often resulted in a realization that you were pretty similar to your interviewee, regardless of significant differences. Some of you were surprised just how similar you both were, or how you felt you understood someone who is so different. This is also a crucially important part of being an anthropologist. Despite the similarities and differences between human beings and yourself as someone who studies human beings, it's vital to be able to identify what is meaningful to others, to show that you understand and are listening to them, so that ultimately in your interview conversations, you are able to dive into deeper perspectives with another person and begin to see more of your own humanness in another. Moving on from our lessons about people being different and how that difference is insightful not only for understanding one another, but also for understanding ourselves, this week we will aim to go further down a road of reflection and reimagining of that which is familiar to us. Our readings and videos will prepare us this week to take an outsider's view, the etic perspective in anthropology speak, on a cultural environment which most of us are already pretty familiar with as an insider, i.e., our current environments. In other words, you will be challenged to perceive and explain the familiar as strange. With everything that is constantly occurring in the world, it can be hard to see through the structures of cultural frameworks that are intrinsically a part of how things occur in the world and how we interpret the occurrence. This week, we will need to reconsider how even the most normal things, like our daily routines when we get up in the morning, what clothing we wear to work versus to bed, what work and bed even look like, or how we pose for a classroom assignment photo versus a photo with your best friends, all have particular connections to cultural beliefs, social systems, and practical foundations that are all intertwined and influence how culture appears in any particular environment or any particular human being. We don't need to constantly think of culture appearing as a core and integral aspect of a population's life and worldview to see how interconnected the world really is by culture. All you need to do is take careful attention to detail and an abstract mind think outside the box of that detail And all of a sudden, something as seemingly insignificant as our trash can become a pathway for understanding a culture and society at multiple scales. This week, we will learn about how anthropologists approach cultural complexity with an intent to dissect and rearticulate culture as seemingly big and small. Culture as a grand woven network of meaning and material that can be traced through any sort of observable human thing. As we make our way through the lesson materials and prepare for our second challenge, I wanted to share with you all a blurb from my field notes in Guam about a realization I made while out and about learning about the peculiarity of what I had previously grown familiar with, the field of archaeology. So here are my field notes with a narrative blurb from Guam. Today, I went on what I first referred to as a hike. But when I said this, I was soon corrected after doing so by my friend and guide for the day, who claimed that we are going on a site visit. My guide and friend is a prominent figure in his community. It seems everywhere I go with him, he has someone coming up to him to give him ningi, which is a sign of respect given to a Chamorro elder that involves raising that elder's right hand to your face and sniffing or smelling the back of that hand as a means of respecting their wisdom and taking in their spirit. He's basically everyone's uncle, even though he has no, even to those who he has no clear or close family relation to. Today, I got a glimpse of why he is that for so many people here on Guam. Our site visit was to a sacred and legendary location called Fua Rock. It's a prominent geologic tower on the coast of the southwest end of Guam that is a cultural and historical landmark, particularly because for Chamorro, it represents, among many things, a sort of cosmogenesis, or the beginning of the cosmos and world, and the origins of the indigenous people of Guahan, the Chamorro. It took about an hour to walk from our vehicle to the base of Fua through a steep but mostly cleared trail that led to the beach where we would eventually find our destination. But my lesson about this place began before I made it to the beach and even laid my eyes on Fua. After about 10 minutes of walking down our path, I noticed that we had moved underneath a thick lemai, or breadfruit, tree canopy, when my friend said it was time to stop. He proceeded to tell me, now is when we show respect and ask for permission from our Tatamona. These are ancestral spirits who are commonly thought to reside in natural environments. He said, we have our own way to ask for permission in our own language. But if you don't know that, you can just use your own words to ask for permission. The important thing is that it puts you in a mindset of respect. With this mindset, you recognize that this is not your place. You don't own anything here. This is their place, the Tatamona. And you must ask for their welcoming and for them to watch over you so that nothing harmful comes upon you. I admit, from my own Western perspective, I first likened Tatamona to ghost and the paranormal. I didn't see any inherent lesson beyond perhaps that I should be weary and slightly afraid. However, with this explanation, I grew to see that the Tatamona were within a webbing of culturally significant meaning and a social system with human behavior. It was directing human behavior to be respectful. For with this mindset gained through asking permission from the Tatamona, you reify your intent to behave in a respectful way. And it becomes a reminder to yourself to listen to those who came before you and show them that you respect them. This mindset seems similar, if not identical, to that which was on display when one performs ningi on a living human being. Once Monday rolled around, after this experience that I had on the weekend to the site visit of Fua, I started to discuss my experience with a coworker of mine, a fellow archaeological technician who is Chamorro And he told me something that really put into perspective my own field of work on Guam. He said, every morning when I go to work and I make it to the job site, I get out of my car and I ask for permission from the Tatamona. I do this because I know the work that we do here has a deep spiritual meaning to it, particularly for tomorrow. And a lot of people think that bad things will come to those who don't recognize that. At that moment, I realized why my friend Joe was Uncle Joe to so many people. He finds teachable moments with others, a chance to expand their understanding about something. And he does so in such culturally meaningful ways that he has inevitably left a lasting impression on many throughout the community. I also realized why he called our hike a site visit, as this was no usual Howley walk in the forest to admire nature's beauty. This was a trip to a location of cultural significance where he knew these teachable moments lay in the waiting. At that moment, I realized that my whole approach to my job up until that point had been only a view of a secular, non-spiritual science. And I thought that view was rather normal. Yet, with this new understanding that had been shared with me, so many of these sentiments about archaeology as something that tomorrow are not commonly interested, especially as a career, started to make a lot more sense. Beyond that, some archaeological work is affiliated with military expansion on Guam that some don't necessarily agree with. It is also associated with a different cultural meaning than what my own enculturation and education provided me with. With this nuanced perspective, I performed a sort of 180-degree turn in my own head about my archaeological practice as one that was largely out of place and not as inclusive of indigenous perspectives that I had thought it would be. Although archaeologists are greatly interested in the past of the indigenous populations on Guam, we were still largely removed, at least in practice and protocol, from the beliefs and deep knowledge of the present-day indigenous populations on Guam. For my other coworkers, some of which were self-proclaimed atheists, trying to explain to them about the Tatamona and the necessity of asking for their permission to be out in nature or at a remote field site location would have mostly fallen on unwilling ears. It was then when I started to see how what I thought was familiar and normal was actually quite foreign, strange, and limiting. My practice and field of thought, called archaeology, essentially focused on understanding past cultures, yet not entirely inclusive of indigenous cultural practices that also recognize and reproduce the meaning of past cultures in the present. I had taken my position, among other things, for granted. My academic credentials served solely as my right to be where I was. I didn't need to ask for permission. I needed to ask for a job. This was hugely eye-opening. New questions were emerging for me, especially on the privilege I had to bypass so much that was meaningful to local people. I had grown to think differently about what was most familiar to me in Guam. And I only grew in that way of thinking because I had expanded my view with new ways of living, smarter ways of living. That's all I have to share with you this week. I hope that this story inspires us all to think a little bit differently about what it is we consider familiar or normal in our own worlds. Good luck this week on your challenge. Enjoy your observations. Enjoy your narrative writings. And I will see you next week. Thanks very much.